A huge number of war crimes during the Second World War were carried out by the Japanese army. It's believed that at least 14 million civilians were slaughtered in their actions involving China before the conflict had even broke out in Europe and throughout World War II. The Japanese soldiers were known for their large-scale assault, kidnapping and executions, and two soldiers even had a sadistic contest to see who could execute 100 people the quickest using a sword. They attacked civilians on a daily basis, and at the end of the conflict, there were a number of Japanese officers and soldiers who were captured and were then sentenced to death for their actions. They became known also for their feared prisons and sites of incarceration, and many Allied prisoners succumbed to the conditions of these. One of these was Changi Prison in Singapore, which developed a particularly nasty reputation for its evil. But after the war had come to an end, a number of Japanese soldiers were condemned there for crimes they had committed. Join us today to look at the executions of the Japanese soldiers of Changi Prison, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Changi Prison was built in Singapore due to a need to develop a new prison in the region, as the others had become dangerously overcrowded. Plans to build a new prison were laid out in 1933, and the new site would initially provide accommodation for 560 prisoners, and was built in a way which would be difficult for inmates to escape from. It had very high walls, and there were punishment blocks included inside of the site, as well as many other amenities including workshops and a hospital block. When it was officially operational in summer 1937, it was said to have been one of the best prisons in the whole of the British Empire, and its design and easy access to rooms for the wardens made it a site which would be copied around the empire. But as the Second World War raged on with the conflict in the Pacific with the Japanese, they wanted to take Singapore, and Changi Prison would have a huge shift in its reputation and role. As Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942, the Japanese decided to imprison around 3,000 people inside of the prison, which was 5 times too many people. The site had been built to hold 20% of this number, and there was a huge overcrowding problem, and the Japanese also used nearby former British Army barracks as a prisoner of war camp, and it was here where around 50,000 Allied soldiers were also locked up. These were mostly British and Australian forces, as well as Dutch civilians, who would later be brought across from different islands. But during the war, the name Changi became known for the infamous prisoner of war camp that was nearby, and became a place where there were many other prisons. There were around 500 female detainees who had been ripped from their children and their families. They were then marched into the prison camps from their homes, and these women and girls were subjected to harrowing abuse and assault. But the girls and women were put to work sewing quilts and other materials for the prison hospital of Changi, and they would defiantly sew symbols of hope discreetly into the material. The complex of Changi became up to 7 prisoner of war and internee camps in Singapore. Around 850 prisoners of war died inside of Changi during the Japanese occupation of Singapore, and the conditions were very terrible. During the day, many of the prisoners were responsible for their own day-to-day running, and many were forced to work outside the camps on different projects, but this was mostly slave labour. The food rations and supplies that the prisoners had access to, depending on what the inmates of the prison could trade with guards and also steal when they could. If they were found stealing, they faced execution and torture. The other prisoner of war camps were depleted in their numbers, at times as many men were sent to go and work on the Burmese railway, and thousands were forced to conduct this backbreaking work. The guards of the prison were rather brutal and were unforgiving, and if a POW did not conduct work that was satisfactory, they would often be executed or beaten very severely. Inside of Changi Prison in 1944, Allied prisoners of war even built a chapel, where they could have services if this was permitted by the guards. The prison also housed the headquarters of the notorious Ken Patai, the Japanese military police, and inside of the prison they would torture and execute inmates who they suspected were spies. One example of this was the Double Tenth massacre, in which 15 prisoners died inside of the prison, and some were subjected to water torture. Severe beatings were administered, and victims were badly disfigured. A lot of prisoners of Changi Prison died from diseases that were caused by the overcrowding, as well as malnutrition and starvation. The conditions were truly shocking, and the Japanese forces were the ones responsible for this. As the Second World War turned against the Japanese, Changi Prison was abandoned following the liberation of Singapore, and in September 1945 many Allied prisoners of war left the place, where they suffered a lot. Many were shadows of their former selves and were incredibly emaciated and had hardly any clothes on their back. But after the war had come to an end, the British would retake control of Changi, and they then used it to hold Japanese prisoners of war, and these included rather senior figures inside of the Imperial Japanese Army, the Navy, members of the Kenpatai, police officers and guards who had worked inside the prisoner of war camps and who had inflicted such suffering. The British even used their own soldiers as prison guards, and a number of the inmates were brought to trial. Those who had been involved in the Double Tenth incident were taken to trial, and 8 former members of the Kenpatai were found guilty. But Changi Prison also became a site of execution. Across in Germany, the Allied nations and armies had seized control of a number of different prisons, and in these they carried out the executions of former Nazis and war criminals who had been condemned. This was also done across the Pacific, and inside of Changi there was a gallows which was constructed, and this was fitted with a trapdoor, and on this, a number of Japanese war criminals would be executed. There were also inside of the inner yard of the prison 3 gallows which were used to carry out the sentences which were given, including those who were condemned during the Double Tenth trials. Many Japanese war criminals would be sent to Changi following their trials, and they would await their death sentence on death row. This could take a number of months, but they would then be summoned from their cells, and they would be informed that their execution was due to take place. The British and Australian guards would then bring their prisoners to the gallows, and these had white caps placed over their heads before they came into the execution arena, so they could not see anything. They were then led across a platform onto the gallows, where circles were drawn on the trapdoor, showing the executioner where to place the condemned and where to position them. In April 1946, 8 Japanese men were executed on the gallows, and the condemned were almost carried to the gallows by the executioners, who had secured their arms behind their backs, and they could not see their way due to the white cap they wore before the noose was secured around their necks. After the final checks were carried out, the executioners then released a trapdoor underneath the Japanese men. They would be left for some time before death was pronounced as they had gone through the trapdoor. There were a number of other executions carried out by the Allies on the gallows at Changi Prison, but also interestingly after the war, the prison would become a place where 260 German prisoners of war would find themselves incarcerated before they were sent back to Germany a year later. But Changi Prison was a site that during the Second World War became notorious, as it was used by Japanese forces as a brutal and barbaric prison site, and the guards who worked here were notorious and the conditions were terrible. Overcrowding led to disease and further suffering, but when Singapore was liberated, it became a place where the British then housed Japanese war criminals, and it was where they also executed many on the gallows. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.